Thank you very much. It's a high privilege to be on this panel with the distinguished scholars and jurists and individuals who have looked at this issue over a period of time. I feel as if I am the poster child for the Brown versus the board. And what I would like to do, my contribution, is to really give you a personal view of what it's meant to me, what it's the last 60 years, the impact of this decision, and of course the role that I and the other 8 played in Little Rock in 1957 and 1958. But before discussing Brown, I have to reveal that I came out of a family of teachers. My mother and my aunt were long-term teachers in Little Rock. And that part of the Little Rock case was enhanced by a teacher pay equity case that was brought by a black teacher in Little Rock in the late 1940s, Sue Cowan Williams. That case was the lawyer that represented Sue Cowan Williams was Thurgood Marshall, and that you scholars, I think many of the early school desegregation cases in the South arose out of pay equity issues around teachers. My mother and aunt were also involved in this case because the teacher that was the plaintiff, the moment she filed the suit, you know what happened next. She was fired. And my mother and a group of teachers in Little Rock pooled together their meager resources and provided for 2 years financial support for the plaintiff. And they weren't wealthy people, so that was a sacrifice. But in addition to that, those of you who are of my generation know that when Thurgood Marshall came to Little Rock to try that case, he was not staying at the Holiday Inn or the Hilton, and he stayed at homes, and our home was one of those. So I point this out that this teacher, mild-mannered woman, had the guts to stand up at that point in time, and there many of us know that that was a big sacrifice, a huge step forward, and a belief that some changes ought to occur. And she maintained her NAACP membership, which for someone on the public side of activity was another bold statement. So when the decision came down on May 17th, I don't remember much about May 17th, but I do remember May 18th. The local newspaper had headline banners that were at least, seemed to me, the size of this table, that said this was going to be the change of life in the South. And I thought to myself as a 13-year-old that the life ought to be changed in the South, because what I saw as the petty inconveniences of Jim Crow, buses, public accommodations, restaurants, places we couldn't go, I thought change needed to occur. But I was befuddled because after the decision came down, and my second remembrance was, how was this going to get done? And the court said, with all deliberate speed. I was confused, as I think a number of people. But Little Rock became this focal point mainly because of outstanding leadership, Daisy Bates, Wiley Branton, parents like my mother and others who felt that once the suit and the NAACP sued the Little Rock School Board, and they finally agreed to a plan of action, which was to take the high schools, one high school in Little Rock, and admit a number of African American students. Well, the spring of 1957, the Little Rock School Board asked all those who were interested in volunteering to change schools, had lived in the Central District, sign a sheet of paper. I, of course, signed this sheet of paper along with all of my classmates. And as the summer wore on, the good governor of Arkansas, a gentleman by the name of Orville Faubus, decided that Central High School was going to be his race card. He was involved in a tough election. At that time, Arkansas governors had to run for re-election every 2 years, and he was up against the segregationists and decided that he was going to make the opening of Central High School the focal point of his campaign. Well, most of you know the history. You know that the 4th of September, we went to Central High School. We were barred by the Arkansas National Guard from entering. They admitted white students, not the black students. The number was 9. There were more than 9 students approved by the school board for admittance to Central. But as I say, a great lesson of life I've learned early, that when it's a tough decision, you're likely to be standing there alone. All my buddies told me they were going to go with me to Central. That first day, I looked around, and I was the only one in the senior class. We spent 3 weeks out of school and went back into court. Again, the attorney that handled our case was Thurgood Marshall, Wiley Branton, and I don't remember the rest of the team, but the Legal Defense Fund, they were our lawyers. Finally, we were admitted to Central. Riots broke out. It prompted, I'm never sure whether they prompted him because he felt it or because he needed to do it, but President Eisenhower sent in the 101st Airborne Division to provide our entrance into Central High School. And on September 25th of 1957, the 9 of us entered Central. I once had an opportunity to talk to Herbert Brownell, who was Attorney General at that time. And I asked him, Eisenhower, they sent 10,000 troops into Little Rock. They didn't need to send 10,000 troops to protect us. He said, well, if you had just won World War II and you were president of Columbia University without a PhD, and you had both political parties dying to have you as their standard bearer, and you had this, as he saw it, a second-rate politician standing between he and getting this decision enacted, he was going to show real force. So I'm grateful that the 101st Airborne, the Flying Eagles, were there to take us into school. That year was like going to war. The easy part was getting in. The hard part was staying there. We spent 200 and some odd days. For the most part, it was a small group of students who were dedicated to keeping us out, but the majority of the students stood on their hands and did nothing. And I think we've seen that throughout changes in this country. But being of the 9, I was the only one in the 12th grade. So on May 28th, 1958, I became the first African-American graduate of Central High School. And unbeknownst to me, as an extra bonus, sitting with my family, he had made a graduation speech at a small college in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. It was Martin Luther King Jr. And so I always say that I've got to be one of the few American citizens that had Dr. King to come to his high school graduation. This decision for the 9 of us was, as we saw it, a means to an end. The expectation that it was going to be the end-all was certainly never our belief. We also didn't expect that 60 years later I'd still be talking about my high school graduation. I thought as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, the only thing I could think of is don't trip with all those cameras. But here we are 60 years later, still discussing Brown versus the Board of Education. My hope is that this decision, as most of us recognize, is interwoven with other parts, employment, housing, all make a triumphant. One of the beauties of my work life is to have had an opportunity to work with 2 people who I think are probably near the top of outstanding Americans. One is A. Philip Randolph, the other is Bayard Rustin. And that experience, and Mr. Randolph always, the '63 March on Washington was about jobs and freedom. And here we are, 60 years after Brown, still trying to find the right means to have education to lead opportunity for all American citizens. My hope is that if I stay around another 60 years, that we'll get closer to figuring out how we make all deliberate speed and this decision come about. Thank you.